As at my father's will reading, my sister walked away with 6.9 million. I received $1. Then the lawyer handed me a locked envelope that changed everything. I never expected to become the joke of my own father's funeral. Not after spending 15 years helping him build his company. Not after being the one who stayed when everyone else walked away. But there I was, sitting at the polished mahogany table in a downtown Chicago law office, listening to my younger sister laugh as the attorney placed a single $1 bill in front of me. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that my mother laughed too. Even my uncle shook his head with a smile, as if my father had planned the perfect punchline. They all believed they had won. Looking back now, I almost wish I could freeze that moment forever. Because it was the last time any of them would ever feel powerful. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, and until that morning, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. I couldn't have been more wrong. My father, Richard Carter, had died 2 weeks earlier after a sudden heart attack. He was 71. To the outside world, he was a respected businessman who had built Carter Industrial Supply from a tiny warehouse into a company worth tens of millions of dollars. To me, he was simply Dad. He wasn't perfect. He worked too much. He missed birthdays. He forgot anniversaries. But he also taught me everything I knew about honesty, hard work, and keeping my word. When I graduated from college, I could have taken a finance job in New York. Instead, I came home because Dad asked for my help. I don't need an employee, he had told me. I need someone I can trust. Those words stayed with me for 15 years. I worked weekends. I canceled vacations. I skipped promotions elsewhere because I believed one day I'd be carrying on his legacy. Not because I wanted his money. Because I wanted him to be proud of me. My younger sister Vanessa had chosen a different path. She moved to Los Angeles. She chased luxury, expensive parties, and social media fame. Whenever she came home, she treated the company like it was an endless ATM. Dad complained about it constantly. One day she'll grow up. He'd always say. I believed him. Maybe I wanted to believe him. The conference room was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Mr. Howard Bennett, Dad's attorney for nearly 30 years, adjusted his glasses before opening a thick leather folder. He looked unusually tense. Almost uncomfortable. Around the table sat my mother, Linda, Vanessa, my uncle Frank, and me. No one spoke. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. Your father left very detailed instructions regarding the distribution of his estate. Vanessa smiled before he even continued. She looked like someone waiting to collect a prize she'd already spent. The primary investment portfolio. He began. He paused to check another page, valued at approximately $6,900,000. Vanessa's eyes widened. Is left entirely to Vanessa Carter, as she gasped dramatically. Oh, Daddy. Then she looked directly at me. I noticed the smile before anyone else did. It wasn't gratitude, it was victory. My mother squeezed her hand. I knew he'd take care of you. Uncle Frank chuckled. He always had a soft spot for his little girl. I didn't react. Dad had always separated the business from his personal investments. Maybe there was more to come. There had to be. Mr. Bennett continued. The lake house will be sold, with proceeds divided equally between Mrs. Linda Carter and Miss Vanessa Carter. And Vanessa smiled even wider. Mom nodded with quiet satisfaction. Still nothing for me. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not anger, confusion. Then Mr. Bennett looked directly at me. His expression changed, almost apologetic. The final personal bequest to Ethan Carter. The room became silent. Consists of $1 United States dollar. He reached into an envelope. Folded once, then slid a crisp $1 bill across the table toward me. No explanation, no letter, just $1. For a second, nobody moved. Then Vanessa laughed. Not a polite laugh. A loud, uncontrollable laugh that echoed across the room. Oh my God, she said between breaths. $1. Mom covered her mouth, trying not to laugh herself. I'm sorry, she said. I just said. Richard could be so dramatic. Uncle Frank leaned back in his chair. Wes, your father finally realized loyalty doesn't make someone special. I stared at the dollar bill. It looked almost unreal. 15 years. Thousands of 12-hour days. Missed holidays, missed birthdays. Hospital visits. Late-night meetings. All reduced to $1. I wanted to believe there had been a mistake, but Dad never made mistakes. Especially not with paperwork. Vanessa couldn't stop smiling. I guess Dad knew who deserved his money. She picked up her designer handbag. I always told you working yourself to death wouldn't make you his favorite. I looked at her. Not with anger. Just disappointment. You really think this is about favorites? She shrugged. The paperwork speaks for itself. Mr. Bennett didn't say a word. He simply watched the room. Almost as if he were waiting. I noticed something then. His hand remained resting on the leather folder. He hadn't closed it. There were still documents inside. Mom stood. Well, I suppose that's everything. It is not. The words came quietly. But they stopped everyone. Bennett slowly removed another envelope from the folder. Unlike the others, this one wasn't white. It was dark blue, heavy, sealed with red wax. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. "S for Ethan. Open only after reading." Vanessa frowned. What's that? Mr. Bennett didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. Your father instructed me that this envelope could only be presented after every beneficiary accepted the terms of the will. Mom frowned. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Bennett replied calmly, that everyone in this room has now acknowledged the will exactly as written. Vanessa crossed her arms. So now, he said, sliding the envelope toward me, I may fulfill his final instruction. I picked it up. It felt heavier than paper should. Inside, something metallic shifted. A key. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Seriously? That's his big surprise. Mom laughed softly. Richard always loved his little mysteries. But Mr. Bennett didn't laugh. He looked more serious than ever. Mr. Carter instructed me to say only one sentence. I waited. He took a slow breath. He said, if they smile when you receive $1, tell Ethan to trust no one sitting at this table. The room froze. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Mom's face drained of color. Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. For the first time that morning, nobody had anything to say. Then Mr. Bennett pushed one final document toward me. I believe, he said quietly, your father's real inheritance begins now. The envelope my father left behind changed everything. I didn't open the envelope right away. I just stared at it. The dark blue paper looked old, almost like my father had sealed it years ago. The red wax stamp carried the Carter family crest, a small oak tree inside a circle. Dad hadn't used that seal since I was a teenager. The room had gone completely silent. Vanessa was the first to break it. This is ridiculous, she said, forcing a laugh. Dad loved his little games. My mother nodded too quickly. Exactly. Richard always had a dramatic side, but neither of them sounded convincing anymore. Bennett folded his hands on the table. Mr. Carter's instructions were very clear. Mr. Ethan Carter may open the envelope now, or whenever he chooses. That decision belongs to him alone. I looked at the faces around me. A few minutes earlier they had looked relaxed, victorious. Now they looked nervous. That told me more than any words could. I carefully broke the wax seal. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten letter, a brass key, and a small business card with a single address printed on it. No company name, no explanation, just an address in downtown Chicago. I unfolded the letter. Dad's handwriting was unmistakable, strong, neat, steady. It began with only 3 words. My dear son. I had to swallow before I could keep reading. There, if you're reading this, then exactly what I feared has happened. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped our family would surprise me. But if they smiled when you received $1, then I know the truth. Listen carefully. Do not argue. Do not accuse anyone. Do not tell anyone what this letter says. Smile. Sheaf accept the $1. She leave peacefully. Then go to the address on the card before sunset. Everything you need to know begins there. My hands trembled. The next paragraph hit even harder. Ethan, I never measured your worth by money. I measured it by character. The others believed they were competing for my fortune. You never did. That is why only you can finish what I started. I stopped reading. My chest tightened. Dad hadn't simply expected this moment. He had planned for it, years in advance. Vanessa leaned across the table. Well, what does it say? I folded the letter before anyone else could see it. Nothing important. Her eyes narrowed. Nothing important? If it's nothing important, Uncle Frank added, then let everyone read it. I slipped the letter into my jacket pocket. Dad addressed it to me. Mr. Bennett spoke before anyone else could. And legally, that is exactly where it belongs. Vanessa sighed dramatically. Oh, please. It's probably one last sentimental speech. Mom smiled, but it looked forced. Ethan, your father always loved making things more complicated than necessary. Maybe. Or maybe he'd finally simplified everything. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped across the polished floor. Vanessa walked toward me wearing the same confident smile she'd worn her entire adult life. She held up her phone. Smile. What? I want a picture. I frowned. Why? So I can remember the face of the guy who worked 15 years for $1. She laughed before taking the picture. I looked straight into the camera. I didn't smile. She shrugged. Suit yourself. Then she walked away. As everyone headed toward the elevators, Mr. Bennett quietly touched my arm. Stay for a moment. The others disappeared down the hallway. Only then did he close the conference room door. He lowered his voice. Your father trusted very few people. I know. He trusted me. I know, and he trusted you. I looked at him. What aren't you telling me? He hesitated. I can't answer questions, but I can offer advice. I'm listening. When you go to that address. He glanced toward the closed door. Don't go alone after dark. A chill ran down my spine. What exactly is there? He shook his head. I promised your father I wouldn't say. As someone watching. Another pause. Then he answered carefully. Assume they are. That outside the rain had stopped. Chicago's streets glistened under gray afternoon skies. I climbed into my old pickup truck. The same truck Dad had bought with me 12 years earlier. I started the engine. Instead of driving home, I pulled into a nearby parking lot. Only then did I finish reading the letter. There is something I never told you. Not because I didn't trust you. Because I wasn't ready. Someone inside this family has been stealing from me for years. It's not just money. Truth? I spent almost 6 years proving it. The evidence is hidden where only you can reach. He opens the first door and us part in the waiting. Not trust appearance. The guilty person is not who everyone believes. The guilty person is not who everyone believes. Thus immediately, my mind went to Vanessa. She spent money like water. She constantly pressured Dad for cash. She had to be involved, didn't she? But Dad had written those words for a reason. He knew exactly where my thoughts would go. I drove toward the address. The building stood on an older block of downtown Chicago, 4 stories tall. Red brick, no signs, no company logo, just faded numbers above a steel door. It looked abandoned. The windows were dusty. Half the offices appeared empty. This has to be wrong, I muttered. I checked the business card again. Same address, same building. I climbed out. The brass key felt strangely heavy in my pocket. The front door was locked. No surprise there. I inserted the key. It turned smoothly, almost like someone had been expecting me. Inside, the lobby smelled of old paper and polished wood. No receptionist. No security desk. Nothing, just an elevator that no longer worked and a staircase. A handwritten sign caught my attention. 3rd floor. Suite 312 sex, nothing else. I climbed the stairs. Every step echoed through the empty building. The silence was unsettling. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, my heart was racing. Suite 312 stood at the end of the hallway. Its door looked newer than everything else around it. There was another lock. The brass key fit perfectly. The door opened. The office inside looked frozen in time. Everything was spotless. A large wooden desk, filing cabinets, bookshelves, family photographs, and on the wall, a framed picture of me. Not Vanessa, not Mom, me. The photograph had been taken years earlier. Dad and I were standing together in front of the company's first warehouse. I remembered that day. We just signed our biggest contract. He'd told me, this isn't success. It's responsibility. Back then, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now I wondered if he'd been preparing me all along. A small envelope sat in the center of the desk. It had my name on it. Nothing else. Inside was another handwritten note. Good. If you're reading this, then you followed instructions. Now look behind the photograph. I turned toward the framed picture. Carefully lifted it from the wall. Behind it was a small steel safe, hidden inside the drywall. The safe already had a key in the lock. Not my brass key, a different one. Exactly as Dad had promised. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were dozens of flash drives, several thick folders, a leather journal, and one sealed envelope marked in bold black ink. Open onl after RU ref AJRNL. As I stared at the safe in disbelief. This wasn't a keepsake. This wasn't sentimental. It was evidence. Years of it. My father hadn't left me an inheritance. He'd left me an investigation. And somehow, I had the terrifying feeling that whoever had stolen from him still believed they had already won. A family built on lies. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring at the safe. My father hadn't hidden jewelry. He hadn't hidden cash. He'd hidden the truth. I locked the office door behind me before carrying everything to the desk. If someone had followed me, I wasn't about to make their job any easier. The leather journal looked worn, as if Dad had opened it hundreds of times. The corners were faded, and a black ribbon marked a page near the middle. I took a deep breath and opened it. The first page was dated almost 7 years earlier. Oh, if you're reading this, Ethan, then I wasn't able to tell you everything myself. I hope I'm wrong about what I'm beginning to suspect. Seth. But hope is not evidence, facts are. That sounded exactly like him. Dad never jumped to conclusions. He believed in proof. Every page after that was dated. Every entry described something that had happened inside Carter Industrial Supply. Money disappearing. Invoices that didn't make sense. Contracts approved without his knowledge. Small amounts at first. $5,000, $10,000, $25,000. Nothing large enough to attract attention. But over 6 years, the losses added up to millions. Dad had circled one sentence in red ink. F. The thief understands accounting. I frowned. Vanessa didn't know the first thing about accounting. She barely knew how to balance her own checking account. Maybe Dad had been right. Maybe the obvious answer wasn't the real one. The next section of the journal listed names, employees, vendors, consultants. Every name had notes beside it. Some were crossed out, others were marked, verified. Only 3 names had question marks beside them: Linda Carter, Frank Dawson, and a Greg Turner. I stared at the last name. Greg had been our chief financial officer for nearly 12 years. He was quiet, professional. Dad trusted him. I trusted him. Or at least, I thought I did. The journal continued. Greg is either helping someone, or someone is using his authority. I still don't know which. Linda has begun asking unusual questions about company assets. Frank suddenly has access to investment records he should never have seen. I leaned back in my chair. None of this made sense. My mother had never worked for the company. Uncle Frank certainly hadn't. How could they access financial records? Then I remembered something. 5 years earlier, Dad had spent 3 weeks recovering from surgery. During that time, Mom had handled his personal paperwork. Frank had helped. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now, I wasn't so sure. I reached for one of the folders. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers, property purchases, corporate filings. Everything had handwritten notes in Dad's careful script. Look at the dates. I did. Every suspicious transaction happened while Dad was traveling, or hospitalized, or recovering at home. Someone had been waiting until he couldn't watch the business. That wasn't random, it was planned. Then I found a photograph. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Mom, Frank, Greg, standing outside a restaurant, laughing. The picture had been taken almost 4 years ago. Dad had written only one sentence beneath it. They told me this meeting never happened. A cold feeling settled over me. Someone had lied. Not once. Repeatedly. I reached for one of the flash drives. Fortunately, Dad had left an old laptop in one of the desk drawers. It powered on immediately, no password. Just one folder on the desktop. Inside were dozens of security videos, emails, audio recordings, bank records. I clicked the first video. The date appeared on the screen. 3 years earlier. The footage showed Dad's office after business hours. Greg walked inside. A few minutes later, my mother entered. She wasn't supposed to have access after hours. Greg unlocked Dad's filing cabinet. They searched through documents together. Neither of them looked nervous. They looked practiced, like they'd done it before. I skipped ahead. Uncle Frank entered 10 minutes later. The 3 of them left together. My pulse quickened. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was evidence. I watched another recording. This one came from a security camera outside the accounting department. Greg carried several storage boxes. Instead of taking them to the archive room, he loaded them into Frank's SUV. The timestamp showed it happened on a Saturday. The office had been empty. Nobody would have noticed. Except Dad had noticed. He'd simply never confronted them. Why? I flipped ahead in the journal. Dad answered the question before I could ask it. If I accuse them too early, they destroy the evidence. If I wait, they become careless. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. Dad had always believed patience defeated arrogance. Apparently, he'd been waiting for the perfect moment. Then I reached the ribbon-marked page. The handwriting looked shakier. This entry had been written only 3 weeks before he died. I finally know who planned everything. I stopped breathing. The next line surprised me. It wasn't Vanessa. I read it again. She enjoys the money, but she has never understood where it came from. She has been manipulated. That changed everything. Vanessa had been selfish, spoiled, cruel. But according to Dad, she wasn't the mastermind. She was a pawn. The journal continued. Linda believes she's protecting her future. Frank believes he's smarter than everyone else. Greg believes numbers never lie. They're all wrong. People lie? Numbers simply remember. I looked toward the folders again. Every document had dates, signatures, transfers, nothing emotional, just facts. Enough facts to destroy lives. A knock echoed through the office. 3 slow knocks. I froze. Nobody knew I was here. Another knock. This time louder. I quietly closed the laptop, gathered the journal, slipped the flash drives into my backpack. The knock came again. Then a voice. Ethan. It was Greg. What are you doing here? I didn't answer. The doorknob turned locked. Silence. Then Greg spoke again. Mr. Bennett called me. That made no sense. Why would Dad's attorney call Greg? Unless Greg was lying. I stayed perfectly still. For nearly a minute, neither of us moved. Finally, I heard footsteps walking away. Only after they disappeared did I dare look through the peephole. The hallway was empty. but an elevator at the far end closed just before I looked. Someone had definitely been here. I checked the window. From the third floor, I could see the street below. A black SUV sat across the road. Its engine was running. Inside, I recognized Uncle Frank. He wasn't looking at the building. He was watching the front entrance. Waiting. My father had been right. Someone was watching me. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello. No response. Only breathing. Then the line disconnected. Seconds later, a text message arrived. Stop looking. Another message followed immediately. Dad couldn't prove anything. At the third one made my blood run cold. Don't make the same mistake he did. As I looked around the office, someone knew I had opened the safe. Someone knew I had found the evidence. Someone wanted me scared enough to walk away. Instead, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something else. Determination. Dad hadn't spent 7 years collecting the truth just for me to bury it. If my family thought $1 had made me powerless, they had underestimated the only thing my father ever truly left me. His courage. I picked up the final sealed envelope from the safe. The one marked of tier OLIAF tier Yehu Raidi Chijoran F. Slowly I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only one sentence was written on it. Tomorrow morning at 900 they will try to steal everything one last time. Be there before they arrive. Below the sentence, Dad had written an address. Not the company headquarters, not his office, but a place I'd never heard him mention before. The Carter Family Trust Vault. And suddenly I understood. The will reading, the $1. The $6.9 million. It had all been bait. Dad hadn't been giving my family a reward. He'd been giving them one final chance to expose themselves. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes I heard my father's voice. Numbers simply remember. I kept replaying everything I'd discovered. The journal, the security footage, the bank records, the threatening text messages. Most of all, I kept thinking about the last note Dad had left me. Tomorrow morning at 900, they will try to steal everything one last time. Be there before they arrive. Whatever was waiting inside the Carter Family Trust Vault. It was important enough for someone to threaten me over. I wasn't about to be late. At 8:15 the next morning, I pulled into the parking lot of First National Trust Bank. It wasn't the kind of place most people noticed. No flashy signs, no marble columns. Just a quiet private banking office serving wealthy families. Inside I introduced myself. The receptionist smiled politely. Mr. Carter, we've been expecting you? Expecting me. She picked up the phone. Please send Ms. Alvarez. A few moments later, a woman in her 60s walked into the lobby. She extended her hand. I'm Maria Alvarez. My father knew you? She smiled gently. For over 20 years, she studied my face for a moment. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. She lowered her voice. Your father also left me instructions. Of course he had. She led me through 2 security doors and down a quiet hallway. Finally, we stopped in front of a massive steel vault. A brass plaque reads Carter Family Trust. Maria turned toward me. Everything beyond this point belongs to the trust. She unlocked the first door. You'll need your key for the second. I reached into my pocket. The same brass key Dad had left inside the envelope fit perfectly. The heavy lock clicked open. The vault wasn't filled with cash. Instead, it contained shelves of organized boxes, legal binders, hard drives, original contracts. Every document was labeled in Dad's handwriting. Maria looked at me. Your father visited this room every month. He told me someday you'd understand why. She placed one final binder on the table. This is the last thing he asked me to give you. Across the front, in bold letters, it read Master Plan. I stared at it. Even after everything I'd learned, Dad still had one more surprise. Inside the binder was a letter. Ethan S. If you've reached this point, then the trap worked. Your family believes they've already won. Seth, that confidence is exactly what I needed. I kept reading. The $6.9 million your sister inherited isn't yours. I frowned. Then I reached the next sentence. Vard isn't hers either. My heart skipped. The money they celebrated receiving was deliberately left exposed. Def. Every dollar has been electronically tracked. Sef. Every withdrawal requires signatures. Sef. Every transfer is monitored. I wanted to know who would try to take it. I looked at Maria. She simply nodded. Continue. Another page explained everything. Years ago, Dad had quietly transferred ownership of Carter Industrial Supply into an irrevocable family trust. The trust didn't belong to my mother. It didn't belong to Vanessa. It didn't even belong to him anymore. It belonged to one person. Whoever successfully completed the conditions outlined in the trust agreement. There was only one condition. First, protect the company from internal fraud. Sai blinked. Dad hadn't left me money. He'd left me a responsibility. And apparently, I was the only person who even knew the rules existed. Maria handed me another folder. Open this. Inside were trust documents signed nearly 8 years earlier. Every page carried Dad's signature. Mine was listed as the successor trustee. I stared at the words. I never signed this. You didn't need to, Maria replied. Your father legally named you years ago. So, everything. She nodded. The company. The patents. The commercial properties. The investment holdings. They're controlled by the trust. What about the 6.9 million? She smiled. That money never legally left the trust. I looked up. What? The will gave your sister the right to receive it. But only if she acted in good faith. I remembered Dad's words. Sick. Before I could ask another question, Maria's phone rang. She answered. Listened. Then looked directly at me. They're here. I didn't have to ask who. Vanessa. Mom, Frank. Greg. Right on schedule. Maria escorted me into a conference room overlooking the lobby. From the second-floor window, I watched them walk in together. Vanessa was smiling. Mom carried a designer purse. Frank looked unusually confident. Greg carried a leather briefcase. Exactly like the people in Dad's security videos. Maria quietly pressed a button on the wall. The room's speakers came alive. Every word downstairs echoed through the conference room. Greg spoke first. We're here to authorize the transfer. The bank manager answered calmly. I'll need authorization from the successor trustee. Frank frowned. Richard's dead, correct. So process the transfer. I'm afraid I can't. Why not? The manager looked down at the paperwork. Because none of you are the trustee. Silence. Vanessa laughed nervously. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. Mom leaned forward. I've been Richard's wife for 40 years. I understand. But the trust belongs to Mr. Ethan Carter. And no one moved. Frank's face lost all color. Greg slowly closed his briefcase. Vanessa looked completely confused. What trust? The manager repeated himself. The Carter family trust. There has only ever been one successor. Ethan Carter. Maria looked at me. I think it's time. I nodded. Then walked downstairs. The moment they saw me, the room froze. Vanessa recovered first. What are you doing here? I didn't answer. Instead, I placed Dad's journal on the table. Then the folders. Then the flash drives. Then the security photographs. Finally, the bank records. Greg's expression changed instantly. He recognized the evidence. Mom looked frightened. Frank looked angry. Vanessa simply looked lost. I spoke calmly. Dad knew. Nobody answered. He knew for years. Frank laughed. Knew what? I slid one photograph across the table. The restaurant meeting. Then another. The security footage. Then another. The wire transfers. Greg's hands started shaking. Mom whispered. Oh my God. I looked at Greg. You moved company records. He said nothing. I turned toward Frank. You created shell companies. Still nothing. Finally, I faced my mother. You gave them access. Oh, tears filled her eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. That was all I needed to hear. Greg stood up suddenly. I want my attorney. Maria calmly pressed another button. 2 investigators from the trust's independent auditing firm entered the room. Behind them, 2 agents from the state's financial crimes division. Dad hadn't ignored the police. He'd simply waited until the evidence was complete. One investigator spoke. Mr. Gregory Turner, you are under investigation for financial fraud, conspiracy, and corporate theft. And another turned toward Frank. Mystery, Frank Dawson. We have a warrant to seize your financial records. Frank looked at my mother. She couldn't even meet his eyes. Vanessa looked from one face to another. What is happening? She looked at me. Ethan. Tell me this isn't real. I believed her. For the first time in years, I actually believed her. You didn't know. She slowly shook her head. I swear, I thought Dad just loved me more. I sighed. No. He loved us differently. He trusted one of us. She started crying. Not because she lost the money. Because she finally understood why. Over the following months, everything changed. Greg accepted a plea agreement. Frank lost nearly everything he'd hidden through fraudulent companies. My mother admitted her role. She hadn't stolen the money herself. But she'd chosen silence over honesty. That choice cost her more than wealth. It cost her family. Vanessa walked away from the inheritance voluntarily. She asked for nothing. Instead, she took a job. For the first time in her life. We didn't become close overnight. Some wounds don't heal that quickly. But at least they stopped bleeding. As for Carter Industrial Supply, I didn't sell it. I didn't rename it. I simply walked back into the same office where Dad had spent most of his life. His coffee mug was still sitting on the shelf. His favorite fountain pen rested exactly where he'd left it. Some mornings, I still catch myself expecting him to walk through the door. Correct one of my decisions. Tell one of his terrible jokes. Remind me that character matters more than comfort. Then I remember something else he wrote. Wealth doesn't reveal who people are. Seasier, it gives them the opportunity to reveal themselves. He was right, the money never destroyed my family. It simply exposed what had already been broken. A year after everything ended, I visited Dad's grave alone. I placed the old $1 bill against the headstone, the same bill everyone had laughed at, the same bill I almost threw away. I smiled. You knew I'd figure it out. The wind moved gently through the oak trees. For the first time since his funeral, I felt at peace. I picked up the dollar bill and slipped it back into my wallet. Not because it was worth anything. Because it reminded me of the greatest inheritance my father ever gave me. Not his company, not his fortune, not even his trust. He gave me the courage to stand alone when standing alone was the only way to stand for the truth. And whenever someone asks me what I inherited from my father, I always give the same answer. $1 and a life that no amount of money could ever buy. Thank you for watching. Don't forget subscribe for more.